It began on a Tuesday morning in a small southern town, where the courthouse stood as both a symbol of law and, for many in the black community, a reminder of years of systemic injustice. The marble steps of the building had seen countless feet march in protest, and its wooden doors had witnessed trials that rarely ended in fairness for those who looked like her. Her name was Althea Carter, a 38-year-old attorney known in her community not just for her sharp mind but for her relentless commitment to justice. She had grown up in the very neighborhood where distrust of the police was as common as church on Sundays. Her father had been a factory worker who died too young, her mother a schoolteacher who raised her children with nothing but grit and faith. For Althea, the courtroom had never been an abstract concept. It was the battleground where lives were won or destroyed in the blink of an eye. On that morning, Althea walked into the courthouse not as a judge, not as a victim, but as an advocate, representing a young man accused of a petty crime blown out of proportion by law enforcement. The young man was 19, barely out of high school, accused of resisting arrest after being stopped for what was described as a routine check. Everyone in the gallery knew what that meant. Routine checks in that town almost always meant young black men being targeted. Althea had seen this case too many times before. She had prepared her arguments meticulously, determined to expose the flimsy evidence for what it was. But as she stepped forward to address the bench, something shifted in the air. Two officers who had been involved in the arrest were present. One of them, Officer Briggs, had a history, though rarely acknowledged officially, of aggression toward black defendants. He was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of confidence that came not from integrity but from years of unchecked authority. As Althea presented her opening statements, she felt his eyes burning into her, his disdain not hidden, his hostility palpable. The judge, an older white man named Judge Perkins, leaned back in his chair with a bored expression, tapping his gavel occasionally but not with any real attention to fairness. Althea knew the uphill battle she was facing. Yet she pressed on, her voice steady, her words sharp. She spoke of constitutional rights, the abuse of power, and the importance of treating every citizen with dignity. The gallery murmured in agreement, their hope rising as her words cut through the stale air of the courtroom. It was then, during a brief pause in her presentation, that the unthinkable happened. Officer Briggs, seated just a few feet away, rose abruptly, muttering something under his breath about her attitude. Althea turned her head slightly, surprised by the sudden movement, and before anyone could process it, his hand shot across her face with a loud, shocking slap. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Someone cried out. The bailiff froze, unsure of what to do. The judge sat up, startled but not outraged, as though even he was unsure whether to intervene. Althea's cheek stung with the force of the blow. Her body trembled, but her eyes locked on Briggs with a fire that would not dim. She did not crumble. She did not back away. Instead, she stood taller, her breath steadying as silence gripped the courtroom. For a few seconds, time seemed to suspend. The officer, realizing the gravity of what he had done, stepped back, his face paling. Everyone waited for the judge to react, for order to be restored, but what happened next defied every expectation. Althea slowly turned away from the officer and looked directly at the judge. Without a word, she walked past the defense table, past the bailiff who still stood in shock, and approached the bench. The gallery erupted into whispers, the tension unbearable. Judge Perkins, flustered, opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Althea placed her hand firmly on the wooden bench and stared him down. This seat, she said with a voice that carried like thunder, was never meant to shield cowards or silence the truth. Today, it belongs to justice. The judge faltered. He looked at the officer who had slapped her, then at the murmuring crowd. For the first time in his long career, he looked powerless. Althea, moving with the authority of centuries of struggle behind her, stepped up and took the judge's seat. The courtroom went silent. The symbolism was undeniable. A black woman, struck down in the very temple of justice, now occupied the highest seat in the room. It was a moment that felt both revolutionary and inevitable, as if history itself had conspired to bring her to that chair. What followed was chaos, but also clarity. The gallery erupted in applause, shouts of support, chants of her name. Reporters who had been present scrambled to capture every second, cameras flashing. The bailiff, uncertain whether to drag her away or salute her, froze in place. Officer Briggs stood trembling, realizing that his single act of violence had shattered not just his career but the illusion of untouchable authority that men like him had relied on for decades. But Althea did not let the moment end with symbolism. She raised her hand, and the room quieted again. "This is not about me," she declared, her voice steady. "This is about every person who has walked into this courtroom and been treated as less than human. This is about justice being more than a word carved into stone above these doors. Today, we reclaim it." Her words were carried out of that room, into the streets, into the news, into the homes of people across the nation. By that evening, her image, standing strong in the judge's seat, the mark of the slap still faint on her cheek, was everywhere. Social media exploded. Hashtags trended worldwide. Commentators debated whether her act was defiance or destiny. To those who had lived under the weight of oppression, it was liberation embodied. To those who had denied systemic injustice, it was a reckoning. The aftermath was not easy. The system fought back, as systems always do. Charges were threatened against her for contempt, for disruption, for daring to cross the invisible line that had kept people like her out of power for so long. But the people would not allow it. Protests filled the streets. Legal organizations rallied to her defense. Within weeks, the pressure was too great to ignore. The officer who had struck her was suspended, then indicted. Judge Perkins announced his early retirement under public scrutiny. And Althea, the woman who had been humiliated in open court, was nominated to fill the very seat she had claimed in defiance. When the day of her official appointment came, the courthouse was overflowing. People gathered outside with signs of support, chanting her name. Inside, the atmosphere was electric, every seat filled, every corner occupied. As Althea walked to the bench, this time with the robe of a judge draped over her shoulders, the gallery rose to their feet. It was not just an appointment. It was a victory carved out of pain, a reclamation of dignity that had been denied for generations. She sat in the judge's seat not with arrogance but with humility, aware that the journey was far from over. But on that day, she knew that something had changed forever. She had turned a moment of violence into a movement of power. The slap meant to silence her had instead amplified her voice to the world. And in that courtroom, once a place of humiliation, she now presided with the full authority of justice, justice that finally had a face, a name, and a voice unwilling to be silenced. Althea Carter's story would be told for years to come. It became the subject of documentaries, books, and songs. It inspired young women of color to pursue law, to fight back against injustice, to never accept the limits imposed upon them. And for every officer, every judge, every person who believed their power was above accountability, it served as a warning. The world was changing, and the days of silence were over. Her legacy was not just in the rulings she made from the bench, but in the moment she rose after being struck down. A moment when the powerless became powerful, when humiliation turned into honor, when a courtroom built on inequality became the stage for revolution. And every time she raised her gavel, the sound carried not just authority, but history, the sound of a woman who had once been slapped in court, and who had answered not with fear, but with justice.